Hi, welcome to valuationpodcast.com, a podcast and video series about all things related to business and valuation. My name is Melissa Gragg, and I'm a financial mediator and business valuation expert in St. Louis, Missouri. I am working on the case study analysis with Michael Koeppel, and he has over 30 years of experience in a variety of industries, primarily focused on technology, manufacturing, and service organizations. He founded eCapital Financing and helped startups in the LA area and Western New York regions. He also owns Lakelet Advisory Group, which is located in New York. So in the series of podcasts that we're going to be doing, we're going to be talking about various valuation cases and kind of highlighting some challenges and strategies for each of these cases. So welcome, Michael. How are you today?
Oh, I'm doing great. Thank you, Melissa, for having me on your podcast. And I'm looking forward to talk about some of the challenges of the current podcast, the software company.
Well, and we kind of got this going because a lot of people who have done business valuations for 5, 10, 15 years are always seeking out additional help to understand some of the valuation theory or the nuances. And a lot of us work either in solo practices or with, even if we're in a large company, we're in a small group. And so some of the issues that we have seen is when you get into complicated litigation, and there are just going to be nuances that could, kind of confound people. But for this particular case analysis, and we'll see where this kind of goes, but we're really talking about a software valuation. And so maybe you can start us off, Michael, and just giving some background on the company or some of the issues that you had to deal with, because it kind of says software company, but it's also in the automotive space. So tell us a little bit about what we're dealing with in this case study.
We're dealing with a mid-sized company, $70 million in revenue in US dollars, and about 12% of that was EBITDA. The founder of the company, about 6 years before the valuation, he founded a company based upon intellectual property he had, and he developed himself. The company has exclusive rights to the IP. What the IP really does, it's a computer-assisted drawing in automotive. It's the engineering drawings, how things are put together, does all the components. One of the challenges in the automotive industry, there's 3 or 4 CAD systems, and the conversion between the two is extremely challenging. Although there's some software out there to attempt to do that, you just can't go from one to the other. And it is a significant problem in the industry. Let's suppose that you could force, for example, let's take Ford and have them all use a certain CAD system. Well, that's fine. You can dictate to the CAD system of what your player. However, when you got the supply chain all over the world, you can't insist that everybody uses your software and your integration of your software. And not only the software, are they on the right version, the same version of your software? So our client was an engineer, a computer engineer, and he recognized this problem with a whole host of other areas. So he decided to write this integration between the two of them. He started a company, and he had a lot of large automotive, some of the big 3, was the big 3 at that time, as well as some major suppliers, so that they could share drawings and diagrams between each other and convert them so they're all speaking the same language. You can imagine that the current system would say, okay, the prior can say we can convert system with 95% accuracy between system A and system B. Well, that means 5% of your car parts aren't going to work. 5% of it's a problem. You have to have a much higher degree in order to do that. And he found a way to do that. And it was extremely successful, such that within 5 years, he was generating $70 million. The challenge with that, Melissa, was with success comes discontent. The other partners were saying, well, the software is definitely the major part of it, but bringing in all the players and doing everything else, we should get a bigger portion of it. We want to sell the rights to that software outside the automotive. We want to sell it, to example, to airlines, to other high engineering industries that could utilize the same software. That would have required a significant rewrite for him, and he was going to lose the patents because they would have new patents of which the company, and he would lose control of the patents, and the patents was his royalty was significant for it. So they had a quite an argument over the direction of the company, and he agreed to sell out. He owned 17.5% of the equity. He had the total rights to the intellectual property. So when you first step we had to do was to, what is the company IP worth? He owns that 100%. So they say, okay, what's the company worth? The other components of the company, he owns that 17.5%. So, and he also had an agreement with a couple other companies in there with regards to royalties that he would collect. And the other partners wanted to be part of the royalty process. So we had to go through this. It was very litigious, contentious, to the point where they were no longer, unfortunately, speaking to each other. It's a shame when you get that much money on the table that what became friends starting a group, that they lost focus of what they were doing or they were trying to do. So not only was this business valuation going to have to be well documented and thoroughly value the intellectual property of it, but we also knew without a doubt it was going to be litigious and it was going to end up in court. I felt very comfortable with this engagement because I was a software engineer, a programmer in a previous life, and I spent 7 years of my professional career in the automotive industry. So those carrots gave me a little extra to understanding the problem and how to approach this valuation. I might add, normally our valuations are completed within 30 days. We have a draft to the client, and then we go out there and do it, a final report within the 45 days. But this one, because it was so contentious getting the information, and we see that so often when these reports or the process of valuation, it's not only the valuation, collecting the information is just brutal, especially, in contentious or litigation support, whether it be a divorce or partner dissolution or corporate dissolution. It adds unnecessary burden for everybody. It's still going to get done if you have to go to court and get the subpoena, but just asking for a prior balance sheet or income statement instead of taking a couple hours can literally take weeks. And that drew it out for a significantly long period of time. As a result of it taking so long, it definitely curtailed the valuation at the end. I mean, everybody in the industry started to recognize, oh boy, because it becomes public information when you're throwing mud back and forth. And they were saying, oh boy, we got the problem. Maybe we got to look for another solution out there, do something. And it did not add value. They were, for example, 50% growth over growth for the prior 3 years of the valuation. But since the litigation was taking so long in the year, they just remained almost constant. They really were hurting themselves. All parties were hurting themselves as a result of the approach that they took.
Well, and I think it's interesting because when you're looking at intellectual property or you're looking at, the makeup in an LLC or a corporation, it is almost imperative that you understand what the corporation owns. Because I think more often than not, if we look in mergers and acquisitions of smaller companies, and obviously a $70 million in revenue company is not a small company, but if you're looking at the makeup of these companies, sometimes when you create that first LLC that owns some of the intellectual property or went about getting the patents, patent pending, actual patents, sometimes that's even pre-business formation, right? Like the actual resulting business. So now you go into a partnership and you get a partner and you're like, okay, let's start a new LLC and we will then license this other proprietary information. And I think I see that happen all the time where you're entering into a partnership and you're saying, well, I'm contributing that IP to that joint venture.
Right.
Let's call you and I have a joint venture now. And what we talk about that we're contributing the IP, but the reality is if you look at the documentation, there was no contribution of IP. There may have been an agreement in place, but I still, and that might be what you're talking about. I still own the IP and I own some sort of joint venture. So I think that one of the challenges that you could immediately see is what does this entity actually own? And sometimes, because we do a lot of, initial preliminary valuations as well, sometimes the owners will not give you all the information. They'll be like, oh, here's the new joint venture information. And then you dig deeper and you're like, where are the patents? Why are the patents not in here? Was that some of what you dealt with in this situation,
Yeah,
or was it even more complex?
it's a little bit more complex, but the heart of the situation was when they started the LLCs, and then they did not outline. Number one, they did not forecast being so profitable. Number two, they did not outline in the eventuality this business divorce was going to occur. They just said, okay, this is what's going to be. You get so much equity, you get this. Okay, what happens when one of the partners or the partners no longer agree on the strategy of the direction? It was saying, okay, we're going to do A, B, and C in the event of a dissolution. And A, B, and C were so vague that the court was saying, well, anyone can interpret this a different way. So we want to have somebody come in there almost as an arbitrator. They went through each party before we got involved had their own business valuator, and the judge looked at it and couldn't believe they were talking about the same company. One was saying the company, okay, $70 million. They got this kind of EBITDA. It's worth 84 million. The other one saying, no, it's only worth 16 million. They said, well, maybe the truth lies in there. So, Michael, come up with a single approach and sit down with everybody, see if we can come up with the approach by valuing the IP, spinning that out, and then value the company as if the company had rights to the IP, but not the IP itself.
Yeah.
And you see this scenario, although in a different way, so often with regards to matrimonial divorces as well as business divorces. It's not laid out in the quote prenup, if you will, for a business, the worst that can happen. And too often companies aren't doing that. It may not be a argument or dissolution, like it could be someone passing away, someone doing. You've got to document all this, what the wishes of it all are before all the money's on the table. Once all the money's on the table, everybody's after each other's throats.
Well, and that's the reality of what happens is that sometimes the agreements sometimes can happen so fast. I mean, we have a client right now that made $500,000 and then $3 million of EBITDA and then 5 and now 10. And, they're going around and being like, hey, what is the value here? Because it's such a volatility and an escalation in revenue, which is all great. But when the documents aren't as clear, everybody goes into litigation mode. And even if you were kind of close in the agreement, of, okay, let's just figure out something to make everything whole. Once you start to engage in litigation, everybody moves to, well, what could I get if we went to court? Like, how good is this agreement? And they start to legally fight about, who has some more legal rights. The reality is a lot of that is in the valuation as well, and understanding how somebody could have a valuation that is completely different than another valuation expert, which means in some capacities, there's always some type of bias in this. If you're looking at what is the high range, what is the low range, but what other challenges, because you talk about this business decline or this EBITDA versus revenue debate, what were some of the issues that were going on that made this valuation be so different between the two people?
So the crux of the situation was if the partners who wanted to keep the company going and go into other business sectors, the key, it was a risk factor. There's a major difference having success in the automotive realm, of which these individuals were experts, well renowned for it. They had the proven track record. To try to go into aerospace and everything else, is it doable? Possibly. Could they hit the home run? Possibly. But there are, as business valuators, as we know, the risks were really high. It's a totally new business sector, different marketing, have to have a rewrite of the software. The individual who, our client, who wrote the patents and developed, wrote the software and developed the patents, he was very happy with his 12% EBITDA per year, and he was ready to retire. He did not want to take the risk of going into all these different segments. And it was justifiable. He did the risk once by starting the company, do it, and was well rewarded. He didn't want to take all of his chips and go back to the casino and put it on the table again. He wanted to cash out. The other players didn't want to cash out. And because of that, there was really significant differences with regards to the risk. The other key variable that caused a big difference, Melissa, was he was the founder. He was the engineer. He was the brains behind it. In addition to being the president, he was a chief technology officer. So when he walked away, the company lost a great talent pool in the human capital situation. And that had to be included in the business valuation. And we see that so often with the small, mid-sized companies or even chief technology officers, key players. If he or she gets hit by a bus or is no longer interested in pursuing with the company, that's a big hit.
Now, was it a situation where they could have purchased the other patents or purchased the outside information, or were you really looking, because in some, what you're talking about, it looks like you're kind of projecting, the future operations based on this change, so either they had a lost profits claim or a diminution of value or some sort of claim in the system. And we call these loosely business divorces because they are partners kind of coming in and then separating. So what did you find that were really interesting nuances in the business valuation?
No, that's you hit the nail on the head there, Melissa, because in a normal situation, if there is such a monster, they could have bought him out with his intellectual property and said, okay, we're going to give you $36 million for it. And okay, for the IP, and you would get royalties of 6%, just hypothetically. That was what was on the table. But the challenge was he was getting IP money on the royalties from other companies in Europe, and he wanted to continue that revenue stream. And the company going forward was saying, well, they'll be competing with us because we want to get into Europe and we want to get in these other markets. So that was the big thing was, okay, if we buy the IP, we want to have exclusivity to all the royalties and the patents, etc. And he wasn't willing to do that. He had too much of a revenue stream. And he was also concerned, and justifiably so, I might add, he was very concerned with, he knew that, number one, the software would have to have an upgrade in the next year or two. Software cannot be stagnant. It's got to move, and he's got to build in some AI and a couple other features into the software. And he wasn't going to do it. So he wanted to know, what's the software worth? If they were giving him $36 million based upon future revenues, well, suppose they mucky up the software without him. He end up with virtually nothing because the future cash flows would be minimal. And his payment was based upon a percentage of the revenue and the royalties. Well, he didn't control it after that point. He would be willing to wash his hands of it like Pontius Pilate and say, here, $44 million, you guys can have everything and go away with it. But they weren't willing or able to do that. And another point that's has nothing to do with what they do not teach us in business schools. You get to a certain point in these situations where it becomes personal, and economics have nothing to do with it. Nothing to do with it. And the law firm involved, I might add, they were constantly putting gas on the fire. You couldn't get all the parties in the same room before someone threw a grenade across the table just to see what would happen. So it ended up, though, that our client was able to keep his IP, found a rational, as we suggested, royalty payment, and the company going forward does not have exclusivity. They have exclusivity with all the current customers they have, and in the market of the North America, the rest of the world, he has opportunities to build the product as is.
Well, and I think that, in some capacities, this seems like a way to protect the IP. When you're going into joint ventures, and like I said, I've seen this. I've even seen where you go to market or try to sell your company and you only want to sell one piece of it. And everybody's like, hold on, we wanted all the patents. We wanted all of the pieces to make this business work. Now, you talked a little bit about arbitration. Were they able to go through arbitration, or did they have to then go to litigation?
We started down the litigation path, and quite honestly, that was going nowhere. It was becoming extremely expensive and time consuming. So we ended up going to mediation. Time in today's technological environment is not a friend to software companies. We could have a great software solution that we would develop here today. And with the way AI is going and computer technology, it might be totally worthless in 18, 19 months. He recognized that this solution has to take advantage of AI. It was manually coded 6 years ago, 7 years ago, and it would need a major rewrite. Number one, to make it more efficient, but number two, the tool that he's doing to integrate all these softwares, they're upgrading. So he would have to upgrade with them at a minimum. So that kind of forced everybody to do the hands. And realistically, that was a major characteristic of why the last year, the valuation process, he was not growing the revenue as well as he expected. He has not made the investment, or they have not made the investment in the IP, because he wasn't willing to do that, because he wasn't sure how the trial or arbitration was going to turn out. So why keep investing in their potential windfall in the event he lost?
Well, and you bring up a really good point, because in some of these industries, like if you wait too long, if it takes you 2 or 3 years to go through trial, it's
Yeah.
almost like at the end, what are we even talking about? Like it's a defunct system or something like that. And so I think it does kind of create this need. Now, in mediation, I've seen, for the most part, it's lawyers and judges are becoming the mediators and arbitrators. But I think if you can find somebody that has some financial background, they're still doing this 2 or 3 valuator process that you may have several people involved. But I would almost say it would be more recommended to get more valuators involved than maybe more litigation involved, because a lot of times everybody's saving up their strategy until the very end, as opposed to in mediation or arbitration, there's a more likelihood that you could say, okay, let's put our valuations on the table. Let's have the valuators talk and try to figure out, like, sometimes it's misinformation. It's
Yeah.
two different sides are giving you two different perspectives of the issue. And when the evaluators come together in the middle, and I encourage it even before you put things in writing, which I know is sort of crazy, but to try to talk through it, because a nuance in the valuation could make, like even with my client that I'm currently talking about, like, are we looking at their EBITDA as 500,000? Is it 5 million? Is it 10 million? Is it really an average of
Yeah.
those? Is it the projection, if they're at 10 million, of it's going to 20, 30, 40? Like what could you maybe tell some people that are in this situation where either you get to, because I know you get to a problem like this and you start to question yourself. You're like, oh, I definitely knew what to do, but this other evaluator is saying it's worth 5 million and I'm at 50 million. Like, how is this possible?
Yeah,
What are some of your recommendations in
it
that?
becomes possible just based upon incorrect information and assumptions. And you're right, Melissa. If we would all get together early in the process and say, okay, in this case, what's involved in the company? It seems that basic. Is the IP in the company or out of the company? Do agree that he owns the IP and the company has rights to use it? It's a big difference than if the company owns the IP. Do we agree and go through a checklist, and those assumptions 101 for a better term will make that gap in the valuation process significantly less? Do we agree that this, okay, the patent may be good for another 12 years? Okay, legally, the patent's good for another 12. But can we all agree that the life of this technology is 5 years and it's going to be like it's just not applicable anymore? Can we agree on this? And those things make, as you know, and the evaluators listening know, those are key factors in it. So you're not doing a terminal value over the next 50, 70 years ad infinitum. We're all agreeing that, hey, after 5 years, this thing's dead. The technology changes unless they do A, B, and C.
Well, and when you're pulling people out of litigation, attorneys know how to litigate, business valuation people know how to litigate. When you're pulling them out of litigation and you're going into alternative dispute resolution, which is mediation or arbitration, you have the capability to do things a little different. And one suggestion that I have that I think always works is that you have the interview with the business owners be conducted with both valuators. And so you get on a Zoom and you say, okay, you got the two valuators, you got the two owners, and the lawyers, you just need to be quiet. And, so the valuators are kind of asking those questions to the owners, but also everybody has the benefit of hearing the sort of answers and getting the right documentation, like having one portal that everybody is getting the same information or the answers to the questions, in my mind, starts to take away a lot of, and you do it at the beginning, like here, let's understand the history of this company, the major factors, the financial situation. Do we all agree that this is what the history was? Do we all agree that this is what the future? Because a lot of the assumptions is where we create these huge disparities in the valuation.
Now, that was an excellent process and methodology to go through, Melissa, but we did it literally at the end. The evaluators said, okay, we're going to carve out these 2 days, and it's just going to be us in the room. No clients, no attorneys. And I'm going to say in my draft report, this is the things that our firm, Lakewood Advisory Group, came up with and why we came up with it. Please explain why I'm off base here. In a professional manner, we can all agree and do different business valuations and different assumptions. The net present value, discount rate, all those other things, the weighted average cost of capital, all to make dramatic impact by just 1 or 2 points. Say, how did you get your number? Here's what I did. How did you get your? And then you can sit down and say, okay, I agreed that, we could have done this or compromise. This is the cost. And then rerun your analysis based upon that factor. And it explains a lot without it being contentious. Or the pressure that may be due to a trial or anything like that.
And again, a lot of times this is valuators suggesting these other methods of how to get along or really just get together on the information. And if you're in litigation currently and you're not understanding how to mediate or the capabilities of how do you do this without the protection of the court, because realistically, we're protected by the court in a lot of situations. This is how you talk to us. This is how you interview us. This is how you depose us. Those are all rules dictated by litigation. Once you pop out of litigation and you're doing things kind of in this alternate land, you have to be the person that's coming up with these ideas. Now, in this situation, how did you finally resolve the issue, or what happened at the end that was the resolution?
Well, the resolution was such that our client, the one who wrote the patents and everything, received a one-time lump sum for the company, would not disparage the company, and would have, as I said, the royalties outside of North America at 6%. The other royalties, the company would also get some royalties for the international sales because they were keeping the software going. They had the support and maintenance of the software. And realistically, instead of doing this forever for the life of the patent, which didn't make sense, we decided to do that for a 4-year period because we know that solution would not be applicable beyond 4 years. And everybody said, yeah, that's pretty reasonable.
Yeah. Well, and I think that one of the things that we've learned in doing some of the valuation mediation process is that agreement on some of the inputs or the assumptions is going to be key in getting everybody on the same page. And or it will identify like, okay, well, you think the cash flow is 10 million. I think the cash flow is 5 million. That alone is going to create two completely different values, if you will, right?
And the other thing we did, I think, is to expedite, because everybody's getting frustrated at the end of the process, is just when the valuators met, we just, on a piece of paper, legal pad, said, this is what it is. This is what we agreed to. This is our compromise, and just had the attorneys memorialize it instead of going back and forth bickering. All the compromises, all the things were done during our negotiation meetings.
Yeah, that's awesome. So what else should everybody know? I'm going to kind of put your information on here. You actually have provided these case studies in a more complete fashion that has more description. And so if somebody wants additional information, they can certainly reach out to you. We also have the capability that we're going to be coming back and talking about case studies in the future. This is going to be kind of a series that we have. So if people have different types of questions or industries or, comments, you and I have been doing hundreds of valuations every year for the better part of several decades. And so we have a lot of bandwidth to talk about, but realistically, it's kind of like a little bit of an advanced class for valuators to understand some of these nuances. Is there anything else about the nuances of this situation that you think is helpful, or to tell us what we're going to see in the future?
Putting aside the challenges of the IP, the life of the IP, all those things, I think you're taking a major step back is if all parties would sit around the table early in the process and just walk through some of these things. In my opinion, in going through this process, it probably would have saved everybody millions of dollars because the value was going down, and expedited and knocked a year off the entire process.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that is a very helpful. I didn't realize that it was also going to, tell people that they need to do more mediation. But you and I have seen a lot of this in the litigation world, is that a lot of attorneys are moving to mediation. A lot of retired judges are moving to mediation. And quite frankly, experts need to be at least aware of how to use it to everybody's best advantage. And the problem is it's a little bit less rules, like there's less restrictions. So you have to cover your own self in anything that you do, and understand that sometimes in the mediation process, that information is confidential and part of the settlement negotiations. But again, you have to protect yourself as an expert witness, that if it becomes available or you now are being deposed or subpoenaed for the documentation, that you've protected yourself in this process. And we'll probably talk about that more in upcoming episodes, but we really appreciate your information. And if you have anything else to suggest people do, we'll certainly take your tip. But if not, we will see you next week as well.
Thank you, Melissa, and have a great day.